It was a stormy night when Detective Harris first caught wind of the case. A young woman, her hands trembling as she held a letter in her hand, had just walked into the precinct. The letter was from her estranged father, a wealthy businessman who had died mysteriously just days earlier. The letter was his will, and it was about to change everything. Her name was Maya, and though she had been separated from her father for years, this letter promised her something she never expected, a chance to claim the inheritance of a lifetime. But there was a catch. It wasn't just the wealth that Maya was after. There was something deeper buried within the lines of that will, something she had to understand. Her father had left her everything, but there was a strange clause in the will, something about redemption and a final chance. Her father's final words hinted at secrets Maya couldn't yet grasp, but they gnawed at her, pulling her into a web of mystery that she couldn't escape. The moment Maya stepped into the courtroom, the tension was palpable. On one side, a group of distant relatives, all eager to claim a share of the fortune they thought was theirs by right. On the other side, Maya, fighting not only for what was legally hers, but for the answers she had spent a lifetime searching for. Her father's death wasn't just a financial matter. It was about uncovering the truth. What had happened between them? Why had he abandoned her when she was just a child? And what did that last message really mean? As the judge, a stern white man with years of courtroom experience, looked down at the case file, something seemed off. He couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. Maya was different from the others. There was an undeniable authenticity to her. And as the trial went on, he began to sense that this wasn't just a battle over money. It was a battle over identity, over past wounds that could never fully heal. Maya's testimony was raw. She spoke about the years of pain, the empty years spent wondering why her father had never looked back. But it was also clear she wasn't just here for revenge or bitterness. She wanted to understand. She wanted to believe that, in his final moments, her father had seen her as more than just a disappointment. But the closer she got to the truth, the more complicated things became. Every answer led to more questions. Was there more to her father's actions than she had been told? Were the relatives lying to secure their share? Or was there something bigger that Maya had yet to uncover? The judge, watching intently, found himself questioning his own beliefs. Was he simply a figure of authority, or was this case something more? As Maya's final words echoed in the courtroom, he leaned forward, unable to shake the feeling that the truth, the real truth, was still just out of reach. The gavel slammed down, and the courtroom fell silent. The judge's decision was about to be announced, but the air was thick with uncertainty. Who would walk away with the inheritance? And what hidden secrets lay in the shadows, waiting to be revealed? Tune in next time to discover the truth. The judge cleared his throat, eyes scanning the courtroom as he prepared to make his decision. But inside his mind, the case was far from settled. Maya's words kept replaying in his head. There was something about the way she spoke that felt like she wasn't just fighting for a fortune. She was fighting for something more, a piece of her past that had been lost, perhaps forever. Her eyes held a mixture of pain and hope, a hope she hadn't yet given up on, even after all these years. Outside the courtroom, Maya stood in the hall, clutching the will in her hand, her fingers digging into the paper. She had hoped for closure, for some sense of peace, but the trial had only left her more confused than ever. Her father's death hadn't just shaken her financially. It had torn open old wounds she had buried long ago. Why hadn't he ever reached out to her? Why had he sent that letter only now, at the end of his life? The distant relatives, who had all crowded into the courtroom with their polished smiles and sharp suits, hadn't made things easier. They had been quick to question Maya's legitimacy. Some of them had barely spoken to her father in years, yet they seemed ready to lay claim to everything he had built. They painted her as the outsider, the one who had no right to even be there. They called her a distant daughter and said she had never been involved in the family business. But Maya knew there was more to the story than that. Much more, and she was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. She walked away from the courthouse, feeling the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. Her father's wealth wasn't her only concern. What troubled her more was the strange tone in that final letter, the cryptic reference to redemption. Her father had always been a man of few words. He had built an empire, but he hadn't built a relationship with her. So why now? Why had he left her everything, including the very estate that had been the source of so much tension between them? That night, as Maya sat in her small apartment, she reread the letter. To my dear daughter, Maya, it began, I leave you everything, not just because you are my daughter, but because you have a chance to understand something greater than wealth or material things. The property is yours, but it is a place of memories, a place where you will find your true inheritance. Look to the land, and perhaps you will understand what I could never explain. She stared at the final line, her mind racing. Look to the land. What did that even mean? The property wasn't just any piece of land. It was an old mansion hidden deep in the countryside. She remembered visiting it as a child, the long drives with her father, silent, almost awkward. She had never understood why he had insisted on keeping the house a secret. But now, it seemed like it was the key to everything. The next morning, Maya made the decision. She would go to the mansion. There were too many unanswered questions, and she couldn't wait any longer. With each passing day, the mystery only grew, the pieces of the puzzle shifting in her mind. Her father's final wishes, the inheritance, the strange wording in the will, it was all connected to that house. But the mansion wasn't easy to find. It had been abandoned for years, hidden behind thick trees and overgrown paths. As she drove through the winding roads, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching her. She had been so focused on the legal battle, she hadn't considered the people who might be hiding secrets of their own. Maya reached the gates of the estate just as dusk was falling, the shadows creeping across the land. The mansion loomed in the distance, its dark silhouette against the dying light. It felt like stepping into another world, one that had been untouched for years. Was this the place where her father had hoped she would find her answers? And if so, what would she uncover once she stepped inside? The wind picked up, whispering through the trees as she pushed open the rusted gates. There was no turning back now. Maya stepped through the rusted gates, the old metal creaking under her weight. The mansion stood before her, dark and imposing, like a shadow of a past she barely remembered. The path to the house was overgrown with weeds, each step bringing her closer to something unknown. Her heart raced, not just from the eeriness of the place, but from the overwhelming sense that this was more than just an old family home. This was the key to everything, the final piece of her father's puzzle. As she walked, the silence of the estate swallowed her. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to enter. The mansion, despite its dilapidated state, had an almost alive quality to it. The air felt thick with secrets, each broken window and decaying door hiding memories that had been buried long ago. It wasn't just the past of her father she had to uncover. It was her own. She reached the front door, its wood warped from years of neglect. With a deep breath, she pushed it open. The hinges groaned in protest, but the door swung wide, revealing the dim interior. Dust covered everything, and the air smelled of age and abandonment. The grand staircase loomed ahead, leading up into darkness. It was clear that no one had been here for years, but there was a sense of presence, like she wasn't entirely alone. Maya's footsteps echoed through the empty halls as she made her way through the mansion. She ran her fingers along the walls, tracing the remnants of faded wallpaper, as if by touch she could find answers. Her father had spent much of his life here, but she had never understood why it had been so important to him. Why had he kept her away from this place? Why had he never shared his past with her? Was there something here, something hidden, that he had been trying to protect her from? The house seemed to grow colder as she moved deeper into the heart of it. She reached what seemed like a sitting room, and there, sitting on an old mahogany desk, was a dusty box. The box wasn't large, but it caught her eye immediately. It was intricately carved, covered in a layer of dust, but there was something about it that felt significant. She hesitated for a moment, but the pull was too strong. She opened the box. Inside, there were photographs, old ones, yellowing with age. Most were of her father, but there were others, people she didn't recognize. A group of them stood together, smiling in front of the mansion. They looked like a family. She looked closely at the faces, trying to make sense of the unfamiliar faces, but one photo, in particular, stood out. It was of her father with a woman. A woman who, judging by the way they stood together, looked more than just a friend. She had seen this woman's face before, in the background of old family photos, but never this clearly. Her father had never spoken of her, and Maya had never thought to ask. But now she needed to know. Just as she was about to examine the photo more closely, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps from upstairs. Her heart skipped a beat. She froze, holding her breath, straining to hear. The house was supposed to be abandoned, yet there was someone else, up there. She quickly closed the box, the creaking of the floorboards above growing louder. She wasn't alone. Maya moved quickly but quietly, her steps deliberate as she retraced her path to the stairs. The air felt charged now, thick with an unspoken presence. She crept toward the staircase, but her mind raced. Who else could be here? The relative she had been battling in court? Or was it someone else? Someone who had been lurking in the shadows of her father's life for years? Her fingers brushed against the banister as she ascended the stairs, each step echoing in the eerie silence. The upstairs hallway stretched out before her, dark and foreboding. Maya's pulse quickened. There were rooms at the end of the hall, all closed off with doors that looked as though they hadn't been opened in decades. She could hear the faint sound of breathing now, not far from her. But where was it coming from? She turned the corner, her breath shallow, her instincts screaming that she was not alone. The hallway felt narrower now, as if the walls themselves were closing in. She reached the door at the end of the hall, its paint peeling and worn from years of neglect. It was slightly ajar. Maya hesitated, but something pushed her forward. Was this the room? Was this where her father had hidden the truth? She pushed the door open. The room inside was small, nearly empty, save for a few pieces of old furniture and a large, dusty mirror. At first, nothing seemed out of place, but as she stepped inside, her eyes landed on something unexpected. There, lying in the corner of the room, was a large, weathered trunk. It was locked, but it was clearly old, likely as old as the house itself. Maya's heart pounded. She knew, without a doubt, that the trunk held the key to the final mystery, the truth her father had hidden from her all these years. But as she moved closer, she heard something from behind her, faint but distinct. Footsteps. Someone was in the house with her. Someone was watching her, and they were much closer than she had thought. Maya turned around, her pulse racing. The room was empty, but the feeling in her gut told her that the danger was only just beginning. Maya stood frozen, her breath caught in her chest, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. The footsteps had stopped, but she could feel the air grow heavier, the silence pressing in around her. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to run, to get out of the house, but something deeper inside kept her rooted to the spot. This was it. This was the moment that would reveal everything. Every secret, every lie, every unanswered question. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls narrowing with each passing second. She felt a chill creep up her spine, despite the warm air that lingered in the house. The trunk sat there in the corner, untouched and mysterious, daring her to open it. But she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just the trunk that held the answers. It was the entire house, the memories locked within it, the ghosts of the past that were still alive in the shadows. Her instinct screamed that she wasn't alone. She turned slowly, her eyes darting to the corners of the room, scanning for any sign of movement. The faintest sound, like a whisper on the wind, made her freeze. She wasn't imagining it. There was someone else in the house, and they were close, too close. The footsteps, the breath she had heard earlier, it wasn't just a random noise. Someone was watching her, waiting for the right moment. Maya's hand tightened around the doorframe as she stepped back, her gaze never leaving the dark corner where the trunk sat. She wanted to open it, to know what it contained, but something was holding her back. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the sense that opening it might unlock more than just the truth about her father. Maybe it would open a door to something darker, something she wasn't ready to face. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft creak from the hallway. followed by a shadow passing just beyond the door. It was too much. She couldn't stay here. She turned to flee, but before she could move, a voice, low and haunting, called out from behind her. "You shouldn't be here." Maya's heart dropped into her stomach. She spun around, her eyes wide in terror, but there was no one there. Only the dim light casting long shadows across the floor. She could feel her legs shake beneath her, but she forced herself to stand tall, her mind racing. Who had spoken? Was it the wind? The house playing tricks on her? Or had someone, somehow, snuck up on her? The uncertainty was suffocating, each breath a struggle as she listened for any sign of movement. There it was again, another creak, followed by the soft scrape of a door opening. This time, the sound was unmistakable. Someone was in the house, and they were getting closer. Maya's pulse quickened. She glanced back at the trunk, her mind torn. She needed to know what was inside, but she also knew the danger of staying here any longer. Whoever was stalking her was not going to let her leave this house easily. Her fingers trembled as she grabbed the handle of the trunk. The lock was old, rusted, but it was sturdy enough to make her struggle for a few moments before it finally gave way with a sharp click. The lid opened with a groan, and Maya's breath caught as she peered inside. The contents were wrapped in layers of dust, but beneath it, she could make out old papers, documents, faded photos, and what looked like a journal. Just as her hand reached for the papers, the door to the room slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. Maya's heart leaped into her throat. She spun around, panic flooding her system. The footsteps were back, louder now, and the unmistakable sound of someone breathing in the dark corner of the room sent a surge of adrenaline through her veins. "Maya," the voice called again, clearer this time. It was not her father's voice, but it was familiar, cutting through the stillness like a knife. She couldn't move. Her legs were frozen in place, her body refusing to obey her instincts. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, closing in around her. Her hand hovered over the papers, but she couldn't bring herself to touch them. What if opening this trunk, reading these papers, was the trigger that would change everything? Everything she thought she knew. "Maya, you don't understand," the voice continued, the words echoing in the room. "You don't know the truth." Maya's heart raced, her thoughts spiraling. The house had always felt like a puzzle, but now she was beginning to understand. She was trapped in it, just as much as her father had been. The secrets were locked away, and as she stood there, clutching the open trunk, the realization hit her hard. This wasn't just about inheritance. This wasn't just about money or property. This was about her father's life, and the choices he had made that had led them both here. She turned toward the door, desperate to escape, but before she could move, the voice spoke again, closer this time, almost at her shoulder. "The past is still alive in this house, Maya, and it's not done with you yet." She spun around, but the room was empty. The silence was deafening. And then the lights flickered. The lights flickered again, plunging the room into darkness for a split second before the dim glow returned. Maya's heart pounded in her chest, her breath shallow. The voice was gone now, replaced by a heavy silence, but it wasn't a silence that brought comfort. It was a silence that felt pregnant with something malevolent, something that had been waiting for her all this time. The trunk, still open, seemed to pulse in the faint light, as if it were alive, beckoning her to delve deeper into its secrets. She forced herself to move, her legs trembling with each step as she approached the trunk again. This time, she didn't hesitate. Her hand reached for the papers, the first document she touched crumbling slightly at the edges. As she pulled it out, a name jumped out at her. Lydia Warren. Maya froze. The name was familiar, but she couldn't place it. The sound of her heartbeat echoed in her ears as she scanned the yellowed paper. The letter, written in her father's unmistakable handwriting, was dated years before she was even born. It was addressed to Lydia, a name she had never heard him mention, nor had her mother. Maya's fingers trembled as she read the first line. "If you're reading this, it means I've failed you again." Her throat tightened. She turned the page over, desperate to understand. The more she read, the more her confusion grew. It wasn't just a letter. It was a confession, an admission of something far darker, than she could have imagined. Her father had known Lydia, had been involved with her in a way that didn't fit the image of the man she had grown up with. But there was more, a hidden secret, something buried deep, something that would have turned Maya's life upside down if she had known. The room around her seemed to shrink, and for a moment, Maya could barely breathe. She could feel her stomach twist in knots as she connected the dots, a sick realization creeping in. Lydia wasn't just an old acquaintance. She was part of her father's past in ways Maya could never have expected. And the will? The inheritance? Was this all part of a bigger plan her father had set in motion long before his death? The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she heard the faintest shuffle behind her. She whipped around, expecting to see someone, anyone, but the room was empty. The door was still shut tight. There was no one, but that voice, the one from earlier, was back. It whispered from the shadows, low and sinister. "You've found it, haven't you?" Maya's heart skipped a beat. The voice was familiar now, more personal. It wasn't just a random presence. It was someone who knew her, who had been waiting for her. And that realization hit her like a cold wave. Whoever was in this house with her, they had been here for a reason. They knew about Lydia. They knew about the will. And they knew what Maya was about to discover. Her eyes darted toward the hallway, and for a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing at the end of it, tall, shrouded in darkness. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but Maya could feel its gaze upon her, like the walls of the house were closing in. She couldn't stay here any longer. She had to get out, had to find out who was behind this, what it all meant. She bolted for the door, her pulse racing. But as she reached for the handle, a cold gust of air swept through the room, slamming it shut with a violent force. Maya stumbled back, her breath caught in her throat. The air turned frigid, the temperature dropping so quickly she could see her own breath clouding in front of her. The shadows in the room stretched longer, darker, as if the house itself were alive, feeding off her fear. "Maya," the voice called again, this time clearer, more menacing. It was coming from all around her, seeping into her mind like a poison. "You were never meant to find this. But now that you have no choice but to finish it." A sudden crash echoed from upstairs, sharp and jarring. The house groaned as if it were shifting, moving, waking from a long sleep. Maya's blood ran cold. She knew the mansion's secrets were deeper than she had imagined. But this was something else entirely. Someone was here, someone who had been waiting for her to find the truth, someone who had orchestrated it all. The inheritance, her father's will, Lydia, they were all pieces of a much darker puzzle. She looked back at the open trunk, the papers spilling out in a chaotic heap. But there was no time to think, no time to process. The house was alive now, and it was pulling her into its web. Maya stepped back, her eyes darting from the trunk to the door, to the figure she now knew was lurking in the dark. Every part of her screamed to leave, but something inside her, something her father had left behind, kept her rooted in place. She had to uncover the truth. She had to finish what had been started. And then, with a bone-chilling screech, the front door flew open on its own, revealing nothing but darkness beyond it. The tension was unbearable. Maya's hand hovered at her side, torn between the unknown outside and the ever-growing mystery that held her captive inside. Maya's heart pounded in her chest as she stood frozen, staring at the open door. The darkness beyond it seemed to swallow the world whole, but the pull to escape was overpowering. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she knew it was too late for that. She wasn't just being hunted by the shadows of the house. She was being hunted by the secrets it held, secrets that had been buried for far too long. She turned away from the door, the overwhelming sense of being watched pushing her toward the trunk again. The whispers had faded, but the unease in her gut remained. This was it. She had no choice but to face the truth. Everything her father had kept hidden, everything she had been fighting for, was in that room. In that trunk. With shaking hands, Maya gathered the scattered papers, each one revealing more about her father's hidden past. The name Lydia Warren had come up again and again in the documents, but now there was something else, something that made her blood run cold. Her father hadn't just known Lydia. He had been involved in a secret, dark alliance with her, a pact forged long ago, one that Maya had been unknowingly tied to from the moment she was born. The truth hit her like a punch to the stomach. Lydia wasn't just an old flame or a business partner. She was her mother, Maya's real mother. The documents revealed everything. The lies, the manipulation, the dangerous connection her father had kept hidden from everyone. Lydia had been a part of something darker than Maya could have imagined, something that had pulled her father into its web and kept him trapped for years. Maya's entire life had been a lie. The woman she thought was her mother had never been her mother at all. The woman who had raised her, who had taught her how to live, had been nothing more than a stranger. Maya staggered back, her mind spinning as the realization settled in. She was the heir to something far darker than she had ever imagined. The mansion, the inheritance, her father's strange behavior. Everything had been leading her to this moment. It wasn't about money or property. It was about power, control, and the legacy of a secret that could destroy her. Suddenly, the house shook. The walls trembled as a loud crash echoed from upstairs. The room spun, and the lights flickered again. But this time, it wasn't just a flicker. The lights went out completely, plunging the house into an unnatural darkness. Maya's breath caught in her throat as she heard footsteps from above, heavy, deliberate, and getting closer. Maya, the voice called again, unmistakably familiar now. It was her mother, Lydia. She could hear the venom in her voice, the years of anger and regret. You think you've figured it out, don't you? You think you understand what's happening here. But you don't. You don't know anything. Maya's legs moved before her mind could process what was happening. She had to get out of the house. She had to find her way out of this web of lies before it consumed her completely. She sprinted toward the door, but just as her hand touched the handle, she felt a cold, clammy hand grab her wrist. She yanked it away, but the grip tightened, dragging her back. "You're not going anywhere," Lydia's voice hissed in her ear, full of malice. "You don't get to run from your inheritance." Maya twisted in the woman's grip, her heart racing. She turned to face the woman who had been her mother, the woman who had raised her to believe in a lie. But what she saw shocked her. Lydia was no longer the person Maya remembered. She was older, her face gaunt, her eyes wild with desperation. It was as if the years of secrets had finally consumed her, turning her into a shadow of the woman she had been. "You're not my mother," Maya whispered, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. Lydia's lips curled into a twisted smile. "I'm not the only one who's been lying to you, Maya. Your father wasn't the only one hiding the truth. You have no idea how deep this runs. And now it's your turn to carry the legacy, to finish what we started." The world seemed to tilt as Maya struggled to break free from Lydia's grasp. Everything had led to this moment. The inheritance, the mansion, the dark secrets of her father's past. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about power, about continuing the twisted legacy her parents had started. And Maya, despite everything, was now a part of it. She finally broke free, stumbling backward. But before she could make another move, a sharp, blinding light flooded the room, and Maya shielded her eyes from its intensity. She heard the sound of a door slamming open, followed by a heavy voice that boomed through the house. "Maya, don't move." It was the judge, the same judge who had presided over her father's will. But what was he doing here? His presence was the last thing she had expected. And then it hit her. He wasn't just the judge. He was a part of the family's dark history, a piece of the puzzle she hadn't been able to see until now. He had been watching her all along. "You're too late," Lydia spat, her voice dripping with venom. "She's ours now." Maya turned toward the judge, her eyes wide with disbelief. But before she could ask anything, he stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "No, Lydia. She's not yours," the judge said, his voice steady, almost sorrowful. "The truth about Maya's past, it ends here." The room fell silent, the tension hanging thick in the air. Maya didn't know who to trust anymore, but one thing was clear. Everything she thought she knew about her past, about her father, about herself, had been a lie. And the truth, whatever it was, had the power to change everything. But just as Maya opened her mouth to speak, the ground beneath her feet shook violently, and the walls of the house began to crack. Then everything went black. The shaking stopped as suddenly as it had begun, and the world around Maya went eerily still. For a moment, she felt weightless, suspended in time, unable to make sense of anything. Her head was spinning, and the pounding in her chest felt like it might burst through her ribs. But then, the silence was broken by the sound of her own breath, ragged and shallow, as if she had just emerged from the depths of a nightmare. She opened her eyes, blinking away the darkness, and found herself in an entirely different room. The mansion was gone. The eerie atmosphere, the shadows. It was all replaced by sterile white walls and soft overhead lights. She was no longer in the mansion. She was lying in a hospital bed, the steady beep of a heart monitor the only sound in the room. For a moment, she couldn't process what had happened. Her body ached, and she felt disoriented. How had she gotten here? The last thing she remembered was the earthquake-like tremor shaking the house. And then, darkness. Had it all been a dream? Or was it something more? The door creaked open, and Maya's breath caught in her throat. The judge from the will hearing stepped into the room, his face lined with concern. He was the last person she expected to see. "Maya," he said, his voice low and soothing. "You're safe now." She sat up quickly, wincing at the pain in her limbs. "What happened?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "Where is Lydia? Where's my father?" The judge sighed, pulling up a chair beside her bed. His eyes were heavy with a mix of exhaustion and guilt. "You've been through a lot, more than you know. The mansion, that place, the inheritance, it was all a part of something far darker than we understood. Your father, your real mother, Lydia, were involved in a dangerous web of power and corruption. They were caught in something they couldn't escape. But, Maya, your father did everything he could to protect you. He tried to shield you from the truth." Maya's mind raced. It all felt like a twisted story she was barely able to comprehend. "What truth?" she whispered. "Why didn't he tell me?" "The truth," the judge continued, his voice thick with regret, "was that your parents weren't just fighting for money or a legacy. They were fighting for your safety. They kept you hidden from the real threats, the enemies they had made over the years. The inheritance wasn't about wealth, Maya. It was about keeping you safe. Your father's will, the mansion, it was all part of a plan to protect you from Lydia's past." Maya's head was spinning. "But what about Lydia? Is she?" The judge shook his head. "She's gone. The truth about her was much darker than we imagined. She was never the woman you thought she was. But, in the end, Maya, she wanted you to have a chance to make your own choices. You've broken free from their past. You're not bound by it anymore." Maya looked down at her hands, still trembling, as the weight of it all settled in. She had spent so many years running from a truth she never knew existed. But now, finally, she could breathe. The mansion, the inheritance, the shadow of her parents' past, it was all behind her. It was over. She let out a shaky breath and met the judge's gaze. "What happens now?" The judge smiled, though it was tinged with sorrow. "Now you get to decide who you want to be. The past doesn't have to define you. It's in your hands now, Maya. Whatever you choose, you're free." Maya sat back against the pillow, a deep sense of relief washing over her. The mystery was solved. The weight of her father's secrets finally lifted from her shoulders. And yet, in the quiet of the hospital room, she realized something else. That while the past had been dark and painful, it had also shaped her, had brought her here, to this moment. She was stronger because of it. The world outside may have been uncertain, but Maya was ready to face it. She had the power to rewrite her own story now, to build a life on her own terms. The journey ahead would be hers to navigate. And as she closed her eyes, finally at peace, she knew that no matter what came next, she would face it with courage and the truth. The past had no hold on her anymore. And for the first time, Maya felt truly free.